Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 14, The Irish Spectre. Alas, he is ashamed of his scar and his brother's crime. Why do we, the harsh age, flee? What do we leave untouched by the wicked? Where did youth hold back his hand in fear of the gods? Which altars did he spare? By Horace, in Odes 135. O wounds that scarce have ceased to run, O brother's blood, O iron time, what horror have we left undone? Has conscience shrunk from aught of crime? What shrine has rapine held in awe? What altar spared? By Conington. Integral communities, like living things, are dominated by the instinct of self-preservation. This principle is expressed in each generation by moral, logical, or sentimental arguments which acquire the authority of doctrine. Children are taught the doctrines which their parents have found useful and which probably were useful in their day. Therefore the beliefs linger after their need has passed. But though it is not always apparent at the time, in fact at every stage we rely upon the weapons and lessons of a bygone war. The underlying needs are always changing at varying rates and at uneven intervals. Some large outside shock is necessary from time to time to force a revision of the data and a readjustment of the proportion. The relation of Britain and Ireland were established during centuries when the independence of a hostile Ireland menaced the life of Britain. Every policy, every shift, every oppression used by the stronger Ireland arose from this primordial fact. In the 20th century it was a fact no longer. When Britain, counting 12 millions, was sandwiched between a France, for 1,000 years her hereditary foe and potential invader, of 20 millions on the one hand, and a hostile Ireland of 7 millions on the other, the anxieties of these 12 millions may be pardoned and the resulting measures understood. But when France had been far outnumbered by a united Germany, also her secular antagonist, when Ireland had sunk to 4¼ millions without Ulster to 3, and when Britain, apart from her empire, had risen to 43 millions, the situation was transformed. Meanwhile, however, parties, with their organized structures, interests, prejudices, and passions, persisted on the old basis and judged and fought as their fathers had done before them. The shock and overturn of the World War enforced the realization of the altered statistical scale. Two other factors, practical and material in character, were also at work. The first was financial. For many years before the war, the taxes collected from Ireland were substantially less than the public moneys expended in Ireland by the exchequer of the United Kingdom. Ireland was in fact continuously a financial gainer from the fact of a joint exchequer. But when, under the undreamt-of expenses of the war and the debts piled up beyond previous imagination, the taxes for imperial purposes rose out of any relation to the expenses of Irish local administration, the flow of public money from the joint exchequer was no longer westward to the far smaller and poorer island. The second new factor was not less practical. By the Act of Union, Ireland was entitled to send 103 members to the Imperial Parliament. The astonishing changes in the relative populations during the 19th century had not affected this quota. The Irish contended that the figure had been fixed by treaty, and the British, with continual grumblings, acquiesced in the claim. There were, therefore, always at the centre of imperial government at least 80 members of Parliament who boasted that they cared nothing for Britain and her institutions. That England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity, that they would take all they could extort by parliamentary pressure and would give nothing in return, that they would throw their weight mechanically disciplined upon the side of every subversive movement at home and of every foreign antagonism. By such like declarations, the Irish Nationalist Party, at least from Parnell to the Great War, maintained their ascendancy over the forces of actual rebellion and assassination in Ireland. However, in practice, such is the emollient influence of parliamentary and democratic institutions, the anti-British doctrines of the Irish Nationalist Party were sensibly modified. If they wrecked the ancient free procedure of the House of Commons by obstruction and disorder, they nevertheless adorned and enlivened its debates. If they declared themselves the sworn foes of British institutions, they played a noteworthy part in the carrying in good time of many of the reforms which were essential to the growth of British social life, and through which these very institutions preserved their perennial vitality. When Irish nationalist members denounced the jingo character of the South African War, they were none the less thrilled by the gallant conduct of their Irish regiments. Irish manhood enlisted freely, and Irish leaders comforted themselves in their hearts by remembering that after all it was only a small war, and that they could splash about boisterously without endangering the safety of the whole concern. The deluge of Armageddon swept away all these minor defenses and small ways of carrying on. August 4, 1914 stirred the vast majority of the Irish people to its depth with a generous sentiment. The heart of Ireland did not beat with the same rhythm as that of Britain, but the moral and intellectual decision was the same in both islands. The British nation should never forget, and history will deeply mark the surge of comradeship with the whole British Empire and with the Allies, which the news of the invasion of Belgium and the British declaration of war evoked from the mass of the Irish people. Mr. John Redmond, with the assent and in the name of the whole Nationalist Party, pledged Ireland to the conflict in words of noble eloquence. The Irish members voted the war credits and the taxation they entailed. The quarrels of North and South faded in the glare of the struggle, and throughout the Green Island, Catholics and Protestants alike hastened to the recruiting offices. Now was the time to strike while the iron was hot. Now was the moment to confer upon Ireland the constitutional home rule she had so long desired. A separate but subordinate parliament for Ulster could then have been agreed to as a mere incident in the wide and solemn troth plighted among all the people of the empire when for the first time they formed a common line of battle. Such an achievement was not permitted in the government, nor indeed can we declare it to have been practicable. Few foresaw the long years of jeopardy that lay ahead of us all. All eyes were upon the battlefield. The Liberal government insisted upon placing the Home Rule Bill upon the statute book, but a suspensory clause postponed its application until after the war. Even this was gravely resented by some of those statesmen who afterwards, in circumstances incomparably more disagreeable, signed the Irish Treaty in 1921. In the building up of the Irish army, other important opportunities were foregone. Irish nationalism sought, and surely it was natural, to emphasize in every way the distinctive Irish characteristics of the swiftly forming battalions and brigades. Banners, badges, uniforms, watchwords of national significance were everywhere in the south of Ireland objects of keen desire, and a bolder indulgence of this wish would have fostered alike recruiting and goodwill. Lord Kitchener saw these manifestations from a different angle, and no one can deny the substance behind his misgivings. The history of 1798 stared him in the face, and, an Irishman himself, he could feel no assurance that Irish armies raised for one purpose might not be used for another. Beneath him, the War Office drew its stiff routine, and much native enthusiasm was affronted or even frozen. Old misunderstandings and imperfect sympathies resumed their sway as the war plowed heavily onward and its excitements evaporated. The forces of hate in Ireland began to regain their control of the national mind, and with them the desire of youth to dare and suffer, but for something else. There followed the tragedy of Easter Week 1916, the attempted German assistance, the mad revolt, the swift repression, the executions, few but corroding. Well was it said, the grass soon grows over a battlefield but never over a scaffold. The position of the Irish Parliamentary Party was fatally undermined. The keys of Ireland passed into the keeping of those to whom hatred of England was the dominant and almost the only interest. It was not till this melancholy pass was reached that earnest efforts were made by the Irish national leaders, Sir Edward Carson, and by the British government, then a coalition, to reach a settlement between the two parts of Ireland and between Ireland and Great Britain. The conferences failed not perhaps by so very much. All this time the Irish divisions fought with traditional bravery wherever the war led them. Voluntary recruitment failed to supply their losses. The war deepened and darkened. With every year the contending nations raised their stakes. Voluntary service gave place throughout Great Britain to compulsion. Canada and New Zealand passed conscription acts. The United States, coming late into the war, sought to hurl her whole military population by rigorous law into the welter. Finally, boys of 18 and men of 45 and even 50, fathers of families and only sons of widows in Great Britain were taken for active service. Why, it was sternly asked, should Ireland remain a favored area full of men in their martial prime? The question of Irish conscription was handled in such a fashion during 1918 that we had the worst of both worlds, or the resentment against compulsion, and in the end no law and no man. The English demand for compulsory service in Ireland spread disaffection through the whole Irish people. 60,000 Irish soldiers were serving at the front, but 60,000 British troops were simultaneously garrisoning Ireland, and on the balance our resources were not increased. The victory brought no joy to Southern Ireland. The thoughts of its people were now entirely centered upon their own affairs. At the election of 1918, all who had supported the cause of the Allies were swept away. The Nationalist Party, which had represented the Irish democracy for 60 years, vanished overnight. In their place were elected 80 Sinn Féin members, entirely ignorant of and unaffected by all those assimilating processes which, under the peacetime surface of wordy and voting hostility, had in fact produced a great body of latent sympathy and comprehension. Here was the old atavistic hatred, pristine and unassuaged. These were the men of single and local purpose, intellectually at any rate reckless of consequences to themselves or to larger interests. Here was the spirit of the Easter Rebellion embodied in 80 members of the House of Commons. There were some parliaments in Europe before the war, there are perhaps some today, which represent this frightful discordance of a minority. The parliament which met in January 1919 was, as has been shown, in its composition overwhelmingly conservative. The pressure of 80 deadly foes might have destroyed its debates or even have led to violence in the chamber itself, but it could not have impeded or changed the march of events. But other parliaments lay ahead. Any thoughtful man looking to the future must count on parliaments in which British parties would be in equipoise and when the balance would be turned against the main well-being of the state by an implacable minority. The franchise had been extended almost to the widest limits. The anti-German passion, which the electors had carried to such unreasonable excess, would swiftly fade. In its decline, all those forces which work the undoing of states and civilizations were reviving. Within 4 years, in fact, a parliament was to come into being in which 80 Sinn Féin members would almost have given an absolute majority to an inchoate, half-organized and less than half-instructed socialist party. For a long time in our parliamentary life and party electioneering, there would be gnawing at the very vitals of the empire an untamed, untutored band of haters, carrying into English public life a malignity unknown for generations, even for centuries. Mercifully, the Sinn Féiners themselves spared us these squalid, tragic experiences. Their own sense of what was due to Ireland led them to scorn the execrable function of baffling and distracting the British realm. Without hesitation and following a Magyar example, the Sinn Féin members renounced all representation in the House of Commons. Not for a moment did they weigh or value the immense influence and leverage they could exert, for ill or for good, upon the decisive affairs of the British Empire. Sinn Féin, ourselves alone, that was the cry. And by an act of self-abnegation, remarkable even when born of hatred, they cut themselves off forever from an inheritance in the House of Commons, which, though invidious, was in a worldly sense inestimable. The two supreme services which Ireland has rendered Britain are her accession to the Allied cause on the outbreak of the Great War and her withdrawal from the House of Commons at its close. The reader, prepared by these general but by no means exhaustive observations, must now be recalled to the current of events. On January 15, 1919, the Sinn Féin Congress met in Dublin and read a Declaration of Independence. On the 22nd, a Republican Parliament met at the Dublin Mansion House and elected a cabinet. When, on February 4, the new House of Commons assembled at Westminster, scarcely any representatives of Ireland, except from Ulster, were present. So much was going on all over the world, and our own affairs pressed upon us so importunately, that the significance of these demonstrations was hardly noticed. Bringing home the army, the reconstruction of peacetime industry, the resumption of civil life, the peace conference, the eventual treaty, and the vast confusion of Europe completely absorbed the thought and energy of the new administration. The scale and speed of world history had to fall by sharp and continuous gradations before the fact that Ireland still existed rose again in British minds. But as the tumult of the whole world gradually and spasmodically subsided with many reverberations, Southern Ireland was perceived to be crying aloud in a strange voice, and the words she cried were presently understood to be independence or murder. During the summer and autumn of 1919, occasional but nationally conceived murders began to be perpetrated upon the humble agents of the British Crown in Ireland, and by the end of the year an organized campaign of assassinations of magistrates, of police and of soldiers, when found in twos and three, developed progressively through the 3 provinces of southern Ireland. The policy of these outrages was not discountenanced by the Sinn Féin Parliament, but the actual work was done by the secret societies called the Irish Republican Army and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The form of warfare was repulsive. A constable on his beat in the streets of a town or village is asked some casual questions like, "What is the time?" As he takes out his watch to give the information, he is shot dead. The perpetrator, although seen by dozens of persons, walks off unpursued, and no one will give evidence against him. Or again, British soldiers returning from Mass are suddenly fired upon from behind a hedge and 3 or 4 are shot down. As the year advanced, these murders grew in number and in scale. They culminated in a determined attempt on December 19 to murder Lord French. The Viceroy's motor car was held up by gunmen and received several volleys of pistol shots. Lord French himself was uninjured. One of the assailants was killed and one of the escort was wounded. All was, however, on a fairly petty scale. Between May and December 1919, there were about 1,500 political offences, including 18 murders and 77 armed attacks. Under the pressure of these events, Dublin Castle decided in August to proclaim the suppression of Sinn Féin, and in September they banned its parliament. In December, leading Sinn Féiners were arrested and deported, and the Freeman's Journal was prohibited. These modest countermeasures were attended only by increasing disorder. The troops and the police bore the strain of the assassinations, for which, of course, hardly anyone was brought to justice, with exemplary patience for a long time. But at length their distress and indignation led them to take the law into their own hands. Soldiers whose comrades had been murdered wrecked the shops and dwellings of persons in the neighborhood of the crime, and the police began here and there unauthorized reprisals upon suspected persons. Large numbers of people in England, themselves exposed to no danger, were sincerely shocked by such undisciplined conduct. However, it will always be very difficult to persuade armed bodies of men to endure with impassive good humor for any long period being hunted down and murdered one by one. Reinforcements were sent to Ireland, and the constabulary were largely increased. The unauthorized reprisals grew with the increasing provocation. Meanwhile, the British cabinet had in September 1919 decided to introduce a Home Rule Bill. This measure was designed to replace the famous Home Rule Act, which had received the royal assent but was indefinitely suspended. The Government of Ireland Bill of 1920 was a considerable measure. It gave real and important powers of self-government to Ireland. It came with the authority of a government and a parliament based upon an overwhelming Conservative and Unionist majority. Lifelong opponents to Home Rule, like Mr. Walter Long, become a coalition minister, sponsored the bill. He could do this because separate legislatures were proposed for North and South, and because the matters reserved to be dealt with by the Council of Ireland were of a non-controversial character. Irish representation at Westminster was materially reduced. After prolonged debates, this bill received the royal assent in December 1920. It was accepted under bitter protest by the Protestant North. They bowed to the decision of the Imperial Parliament. They used their option to contract out of the Dublin Parliament and set up their own legislature and government as prescribed by the Act. Had the powers of this measure been accepted and exercised in a reasonable and friendly spirit by the dominant elements in Southern Ireland, there is little doubt that the Irish national grievance would have been substantially met, and certainly Ireland, escaping a long and painful ordeal, would today be more prosperous, more influential, and more united. No doubt there had been many occasions since 1886 when such a measure, if it could have been presented by a Conservative government, would have been accepted with goodwill. In 1920 it was simply ignored by the ruling Sinn Féin organizations. They refused to put it into operation in Southern Ireland, and the campaign of disorder and systematized murder continued to grow. Nevertheless, the Bill of 1920 was a decisive turning point in the history of the two islands. In important respects, it was tantamount to the repeal of the Act of Union after 120 years of friction. As such, it profoundly affected the Unionist Party, whose very name lost its meaning. It had a more practical and irrevocable importance. Ulster, or rather its 6 predominantly Protestant counties, became a separate entity clothed with constitutional form, possessing all the organs of government and administration, including police and the capacity of self-defense for the purpose of internal order. From that moment the position of Ulster became unassailable. It could never again be said that Ulster Protestants barred the aspirations of their southern fellow countrymen. They had indeed, on the contrary, acquiesced in a large disturbance of their own foundations, and, by their compliance with the decision of the Imperial Parliament, exposed themselves to poignant reproaches from the Unionists of Southern Ireland. Every argument of self-determination ranged itself henceforward upon their side. Never again could any British party contemplate putting pressure upon them to part with the constitution they had reluctantly accepted. They were masters of their own house, and small though it might be, it was morally and logically founded upon a rock. The Act of 1920 ended forever this phase of the Irish problem. During the whole of 1920 the murder campaign grew and spread in Ireland. The scale of the outrages increased. In one ambush 15 out of 17 auxiliary police were killed. On a November morning 14 officers, believed by the rebels to be engaged in intelligence work, were shot, unarmed, several in the presence of their wives, in their billets in Dublin. The faithful recital of these deeds would fill a chapter. They must not further darken these pages. In the same period considerable measures were taken by the British government. Large numbers of additional troops were sent to Ireland. Armored cars and motor cars, forces of police and military were organized upon an important scale, and a special police force was formed entirely of ex-officers and from the wartime armies. These special police, who ultimately amounted to 7,000 men, were nicknamed on account of their dark cap and khaki uniform the Black and Tans. It has become customary to lavish abuse upon the Black and Tans, and to treat them as a mob of bravos and terrorists suddenly let loose upon the fair pastures of Ireland. In fact, however, they were selected from a great press of applicants on account of their intelligence, their characters, and their records in the war. Originally they were intended to supplement the hard-pressed Royal Irish Constabulary. But in grappling with murder they developed within themselves a very strong counter-terrorist activity. They acted with much the same freedom as the Chicago or New York police permit themselves in dealing with armed gangs. When any of their own men or police or military comrades were murdered, they beat up the haunts of well-known malignants, or those whom they conceived to be malignants, and sharply challenged suspected persons at the pistol's point. Obviously, there can be no defense for such conduct except the kind of attack to which it was a reply. Liberals, who had always supported Home Rule, were on strong ground when they dwelt upon the consequences of its denial. They were reinforced by another school of thought which had much less justice or logic behind it. A certain number of high Tories, while rigidly opposing any effective concession to Irish nationalist demands, were still more violent in their denunciations of the Black and Tans. They demanded that the government should strictly and inflexibly maintain order by the regular processes of law, and that it should punish unsparingly any of its agents who, no matter what the provocation, departed a hair's breadth from the orthodox procedure of a civilized state in time of peace. Maintain the Union, they cried, and do not give way to violence. Adhere with circumspection to the law of the land. Detect and arrest the criminals and bring them to justice before the courts. This was easy to prescribe, but impossible to perform. Where no witness would give evidence or could give it only at the peril of their lives, where no juries would convict, the ordinary process of law were non-existent. From another angle, the military authorities contributed unhelpful counsel. Headed by the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, they demanded incessantly universal martial law throughout Southern Ireland. How this would have solved the problem was never explained. These military authorities were vehement in repudiating any suggestion of counter-terrorism. They contented themselves with vague assertions that putting rebellious Ireland under martial law would show that the government was in earnest. I never received during my tenure of the War Office any practical or useful advice on this subject from these quarters. My military advisers also naturally complained continuously of the strain on the troops, the bulk of them post-war recruits, in having to live month after month in the constant expectation of being murdered by some apparently inoffensive member of the civil population. They dwelt with insistence, both in my time and in that of my successor, Sir Lemming Worthington Evans, on the urgent need of reinforcing the army in Ireland and simultaneously relieving the bulk of the existing garrison. By an occult and unstudied combination between the opinions of the Tory legalists and those of the military martial law men, martial law being no law, the decision was induced and announced in Parliament that authorized reprisals such as would have ruled in a war zone, and these only, should be adopted. All unauthorized action on the part of the police or the special police was to be repressed with rigor. This resolve came with great relief to the Irish secret societies. To do them justice, they were almost the only people in the whole world who were not shocked by the activities of the Black and Tans. They thought it fair that their own measure should be meted out to them. By the end of 1920 they found themselves extremely hard-pressed by the activities of the Black and Tans, who, with increasing information and ruthlessness, were striking down, in the darkness, those who struck from the darkness. Mr. Lloyd George went so far as to say at the Guildhall banquet on November 9, "We have murder by the throat." The policy of authorized reprisals came into force on New Year's Day 1921. It speedily proved far less effective than the rough-and-ready measures of the special police. On the morrow of an outrage, the military sallied forth in a brigade to burn a cottage. In the night, the Sinn Féiners padded out and burned a country house. Meanwhile, the actual power of the British forces to go wherever they wished and do whatever they thought proper never encountered appreciable opposition. Sweeps were made by cavalry and motor cars on 30 or 40-mile fronts, and every mail taken into the net was meticulously examined, often without a single person being found accountable. And perhaps the same night an audacious murder took place on the very ground so thoroughly scoured. It was clear by the early summer of 1921 that Britain was at the parting of the ways. It would have been quite easy to quell the odious and shameful form of warfare by which we were assailed and into which we were being increasingly drawn, by using the ruthlessness which the Russian communists adopt towards their fellow countrymen. The arrest of large numbers of persons believed by the police to be in sympathy with the rebels and the summary execution of 4 or 5 of these hostages, many of whom must certainly have been innocent, for every life taken of a government servant might have been a remedy at once sombre and efficacious. It was a cause of which the British people in the hour of their deliverance were utterly incapable. Public opinion recoiled with anger and irritation even from the partial measures into which our agents had been gradually drawn. The choice was by now clearly open: crush them with iron and unstinted force, or try to give them what they want. These were the only alternatives, and though each had ardent advocates, most people were unprepared for either. Here indeed was the Irish Spectre, horrid and inexorcisable. No British government in modern times has ever appeared to make so complete and sudden a reversal of policy as that which ensued. In May, the whole power of the state and all the influence of the coalition were used to hunt down the murder gang. In June, the goal was a lasting reconciliation with the Irish people. The vivid contrast between these two extremes might well furnish a theme of mockery to superficial judgment. Actually, however, there were only two courses: war with the utmost violence or peace with the utmost patience. Vast arguments could be deployed for either course, but nothing in sense or mercy could excuse weak compromises between the two. In ordinary domestic politics, these sharp dichotomies are usually inapplicable. But when the sword is bared and the pistol pointed, and blood flows and homes are laid waste, it ought to be one thing or the other. The legend has obtained some credence that this diametrical change of policy arose from a waning nerve power in the Prime Minister. For instance, Sir Neville Macready has suggested in his recently published memoirs that he found Mr. Lloyd George concerned about his personal safety. Such insinuations are contrary to the fact. Up till the summer of 1921, no one was more resolute or ready to be more ruthless against the Irish rebellion than Mr. Lloyd George. He had constantly to measure the British political situation. This required, as a prelude to any form of Home Rule, first the security of Ulster, and secondly a clear victory over the gunmen. The first condition was broadly satisfied by the 1920 Act. The second was certainly not yet attained. What then were the causes and incidents which induced him to abandon his policy of repression before it was effective? I shall set them out as I measured them at the time. By April 1921, the British problem had become the main preoccupation of the government. The Prime Minister showed himself markedly disposed to fight the matter out at all costs, and to rely for this purpose upon the age-long loyalties of the Conservative Party. The Cabinet were at one with him in this. Upon the method, however, there were two distinct opinions. It was evident to all ministers that efforts to restore order in Ireland must be made during the rest of the year upon an extraordinary scale. 100,000 new special troops and police must be raised. Thousands of motor cars must be armoured and equipped. The 3 southern provinces of Ireland must be closely laced with cordons of blockhouses and barbed wire. A systematic rummaging and questioning of every individual must be put in force. In order to paralyze the activities of a few thousand persons, the entire population must, when required, be made to account for every hour of their time. There was no physical bar to accomplishing all this. It was a matter of men and money, and both would have been supplied in ample measure by a parliament which still had 3 years of constitutional life. These were the kind of projects which now came bluntly into view. Some ministers, of whom I was one, while ready to undertake the responsibilities and to share the exertions which such a policy involved, held that these drastic processes should be accompanied by the offer of the widest possible measure of self-government in Southern Ireland. Let us, they said, lay aside every impediment. Let us make it clear that the Irish people are being forced by Sinn Féin to fight not for Home Rule, but for separation, not for an Irish Parliament under the Crown, but for a revolutionary republic. An impressive debate in Cabinet took place upon this issue. Personally, I wished to see the Irish confronted on the one hand with the realization of all that they had asked for, and of all that Gladstone had striven for, and upon the other with the most unlimited exercise of rough-handed force. I was therefore on the side of those who wished to couple a tremendous onslaught with the fairest offer. It will be sufficient to say that the diversion of opinion was almost evenly balanced, but that weight, apart from numbers, inclined to those who preferred the dual policy. The Prime Minister was astonished and indeed startled to find how many Conservatives adhered to this more complicated course. I could see that he was profoundly impressed both by the argument and by the authority behind it. On the question being put, would you then allow a Dublin Parliament, like any other dominion, to levy a tariff against British goods? The answer was fiercely made: how can this petty matter be weighed against the grievous action we are preparing? As usual, when there is a deep and honest division in a cabinet united on main issues, nothing was settled at the moment, and everyone went home to chew the cud. I must record my opinion that Mr. Lord George reached the conclusion that a policy of unmitigated repression in Ireland would not command wholehearted support even among the Conservatives. The Prime Minister had on several occasions, in the name of the Cabinet, offered to negotiate for a settlement, provided the Irish rebels were prepared to accept the Crown and the imperial connection. Renewed efforts were now made to establish contact. In May of 1921, Lord Fitzalan, one of the leaders of the English Catholics, succeeded Lord French as Viceroy. Devotion to public duty alone inspired him to undertake so melancholy a task. 3 days later, Sir James Craig, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, at the request of Mr. Lloyd George, met Mr. de Valera in his hiding place. This meeting, which had been the subject of considerable previous negotiation, was certainly a remarkable episode. The Ulster leader, representative of all that had stood against Home Rule, was conducted by the Sinn Féin gunmen through long, devious and secret routes to the headquarters of the leader of the Irish Rebellion. His robust outlook and single-minded sense of duty to the well-being of the Empire, joined to disdain of personal risks, capital or political, led Sir James Craig to undertake this mission. His conversations with the Sinn Féin leader were abortive. At the end of 4 hours, Mr. de Valera's recital of Irish grievances had only reached the iniquities of Poyning's Act in the days of Henry VII. There were by that time various reasonable excuses for terminating not a discussion, but a lecture. Sir James Craig placed himself again in the hands of his guides and was motored circuitously and erratically back to Dublin. They were 3 in the little car rattling and bumping over the ill-kept roads, 2 Sinn Féiners, whose lives were probably forfeit, and the Prime Minister of Orange Ulster. Suddenly behind them arrived an armoured lorry filled with black and tans. Although Sir James Craig's conductors were not particularly anxious to be scrutinized at close quarters, they judged it prudent to let it pass them. The heavy vehicle ran by within a foot of the little car. When, after inquisitively continuing level for some time, it finally drew ahead and rumbled on, the 3 Irishmen, so differently circumstanced, exchanged glances of perfect comprehension. Although the actual Craig-de Valera conversations were barren, a rope had been flung across the chasm. From that moment British government agents in Ireland were upon occasion, through one channel or another, in touch with the Sinn Féin headquarters. At the end of May, Sir Neville Macready presented a pessimistic report upon the state of Ireland. While, he said, I am of opinion that the troops at present in Ireland may be dependent upon to continue to do their best under present circumstances through this summer, I am convinced that by October, unless a peaceful solution has been reached, it will not be safe to ask the troops to continue there another winter under the conditions which obtained there during the last. Not only the men, for the sake of their moral and training, should be removed out of the Irish atmosphere, but by that time there will be many officers who, although they may not confess it, will in my opinion be quite unfit to continue to serve in Ireland without a release for a very considerable period. Unless I am entirely mistaken, the present state of affairs in Ireland, so far as regards the troops serving there, must be brought to a conclusion by October, or steps must be taken to relieve practically the whole of the troops together with the great majority of the commanders and their staff. This report was endorsed by Sir Henry Wilson. There could of course be no question of giving effect to it. These despairing counsels were not justified by the facts, nor in any case was there any possibility of relief. Not relief, but reinforcement on a large scale, or the old forces with new forces added, was the obvious step, and this, though costly and troublesome, was quite practicable. Still, while the cabinet did not accept, they were bound to weigh these sweeping and alarmist assertions of the Commander-in-Chief in Ireland, endorsed as they were by the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. All these pressures and tendencies might have remained subliminal but for the spark of an event. On June 22, the first Parliament of Northern Ireland was to be inaugurated by the King in person. It would not have been right for ministers to put in the mouth of the sovereign words which could only appeal to the people of Northern Ireland. It is well known that the king, acting in harmony not only with the letter, but with the spirit of the Constitution, earnestly expressed the wish that language should be used which would appeal to the whole of his Irish subjects, south as well as north, green as well as orange. The outlook of the sovereign lifted high above the strife of party, above the clash of races and religions, and sectional divergencies of view necessarily and naturally comprised the general interest of the empire as a whole, and nothing narrower. The Prime Minister and leading members of the government therefore took the responsibility, which rested with them, and with them alone, of inserting in the royal speech what was in effect a sincere appeal for a common effort to end the odious and disastrous conflict. "The eyes of the whole empire," said the king with evident emotion, "are on Ireland today, that empire in which so many nations and races have come together in spite of ancient feuds, and in which new nations have come to birth within the lifetime of the youngest in this hall. I am emboldened by that thought to look beyond the sorrow and the anxiety which have clouded of late my vision of Irish affairs. I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards an end of strife among her people, whatever their race or creed. In that I hope I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. It is my earnest desire that in Southern Ireland, too, there may ere long take place a parallel to what is now passing in this hall. That there a similar occasion may present itself and a similar ceremony be performed. For this the Parliament of the United Kingdom has in the fullest measure provided the powers, for this the Parliament of Ulster is pointing the way. The future lies in the hands of my Irish people themselves. May this historic gathering be the prelude of a day in which the Irish people, north and south, under one Parliament or two, as those parliaments may themselves decide, shall work together in common love for Ireland upon the sure foundation of mutual justice and respect." No one responsible for the king's speech had contemplated immediate results in action, but in such declarations everything depends upon the sounding board. The King-Emperor, the embodiment of the common inheritance, discharging his constitutional duty at the peril of his life, had struck a note which rang and reverberated, and which all ears were attuned to hear. The response of public opinion in both islands to that appeal was instant, deep and widespread, and from that moment events moved forward in unbroken progression to the establishment of the Irish Free State. On June 24, Mr. Lloyd George invited Sir James Craig and Mr. de Valera to a conference in London. On July 11, the invitations were accepted, and a truce, the terms of which had been settled on the 9th, was proclaimed. No act of British state policy in which I have been concerned aroused more violently conflicting emotions than the Irish settlement. For a system of human government so vast and so variously composed as the British Empire to compact with open rebellion in the peculiar form in which it was developed in Ireland was an event which might well have shaken to its foundations that authority upon which the peace and order of hundreds of millions of people of many races and communities were erected. Servants of the Crown, in the faithful performance of their duty, had been and were being cruelly murdered as a feature in a deliberately adopted method of warfare. It was only possible to say of those responsible for these acts that they were not actuated by selfish or sordid motives, that they were ready to lay down their own lives, and that in the main they were supported by the sentiment of their fellow countrymen. To receive the leaders of such men at the council board and to attempt to form through their agency the government of a civilized state must be regarded as one of the most questionable and hazardous experiments upon which a great empire, in the plenitude of its power, had ever embarked. On the other hand stood the history of Ireland, an unending quarrel and mutual injuries done to each other by sister countries and close neighbors, generation after generation, and the earnest desire in Britain was to end this hateful feud. During the 19th century both England and Ireland had restated their cases in forms far superior to those of the dark times of the past. England had lavished remedial measures and conciliatory procedures upon Ireland. Ireland, in the main, had rested herself upon constitutional action to support her claim. It would have been possible in 1886 to have reached a solution on a basis infinitely less perilous both to Ireland and to Great Britain than that to which we were ultimately drawn. Said Mr. Gladstone in the House of Commons before the fateful division on the Home Rule Bill, "Ireland stands at your bar expectant, hopeful, almost suppliant. Her words are words of truth and soberness. She asks a blessed oblivion of the past. And in that oblivion our interest is deeper even than hers. Think, I beseech you, think well, think wisely, think not for the moment, but for the years that are to come, before you reject this bill." And after all, we were the victors in the greatest struggle of all time. We did not claim more than our true share in those supreme events, but it was sufficient to make us easy in our minds about a matter so comparatively small in a material sense as Ireland. No one, for instance, could say that the life of the empire was in danger when every hostile force in the world, including armies of millions of soldiers, had passed out of existence, when the German fleet lay at the bottom of Scapa Flow, and when every armed opponent was prostrate. No one could say we were a cowardly or decadent race. There may be no logical relevance for such thoughts, but they contributed an important factor to the national decision. And what was the alternative? It was to plunge one small corner of the empire into an iron repression, which could not be carried through without an admixture of murder and counter-murder, terror and counter-terror. Only national self-preservation could have excused such a policy, and no reasonable man could allege that self-preservation was involved. However, the die was now cast. A truce has been proclaimed. The gunmen emerged from their hiding places and strode the streets of Dublin as the leaders of a nation as old and as proud as our own. The troops and police and Black and Tans, but yesterday urged on to extirpate the murder gang, now stood relaxed and embarrassed while parleys on equal terms were in full swing. Impossible thereafter to resume the same kind of war. Impossible to refill or heat up again those cauldrons of hatred and contempt on which such quarrels are fed. Other courses remained at our disposal as a last resort. Ports and cities could be held. Dublin could be held. Ulster could be defended. All communication between Sinn Féin Ireland and the outer world could be severed. All trade between the two islands, that is to say, the whole of Irish trade except from Ulster, could be stopped, at a price. But from the moment of the truce, the attempt to govern Southern Ireland upon the authority of the Imperial Parliament had come to an end. It is no part of this tale to record, except in outline, the course of the negotiations or to recite the documents and records in which their public interchange was embodied. The opening contact was, however, notable. On July 14, the first of several interviews took place between Mr. de Valera and Mr. Lloyd George in the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. Mr. de Valera had himself introduced with ceremony by the representative of the Irish Republic in London, Mr. Art O'Brien. The Prime Minister, never a greater artist than in the first moment of a fateful interview, received the Irish chieftain cordially as a brother Celt. Mr. de Valera was guarded and formal. He presented a lengthy document in the Irish language, and then for convenience a translation in English. The Prime Minister's literary curiosity was excited by its heading, Saorstad Éireann. Saorstad, he remarked, did not strike his ear as Irish. What was its literal translation? After a pause, Mr. de Valera replied that literally it meant Free State. I see, said the Prime Minister. Saorstad means Free State. Then what is your Irish word for Republic? While the two Irishmen were discussing together in English what answer they should give to this innocent question, the Prime Minister turned to Professor Thomas Jones of the Cabinet Secretariat and conversed with him in Welsh, to the evident discomfiture of his English-speaking Sinn Féin visitors. Eventually, as Mr. de Valera could get no further than that Saorstad meant Free State, the Prime Minister observed, "Must we not admit that the Celts never were republicans and have no native word for such an idea?" A long embarrassed silence followed. This was the first move in a dialogue continued for many hours until, after an exhaustive survey of Irish history in ancient and medieval times, it became clear that progress could only be made by the British government tabling its own proposals. These were handed to Mr. de Valera on July 20. They comprised complete Dominion Home Rule involving, of course, autonomous control of finance and taxation, of the police and the military. 6 conditions were attached. 4 dealt with the naval and military aspects. 1 prohibited protective duties between the two islands, and the last imposed upon Ireland a share to be fairly determined of the jointly contracted national debt. These proposals were rejected by Mr. de Valera, who proclaimed the principle of complete independence and repudiated the Crown. The Prime Minister, in his replies, made it plain that the British government could discuss no settlement which involves a refusal on the part of Ireland to accept our invitation to a free, equal and loyal partnership in the British Commonwealth under one sovereign. The correspondence became lengthy and the difficulties no smaller. The Cabinet at that time, scattered in the holiday season, met on September 7 at Inverness. 2 courses appeared to be open: to summon Mr. de Valera to a conference conditional on allegiance to the Crown, or to resume the unconditional parleys with him in the presence of other Irish representatives. The reply, which was eventually settled, asked whether Mr. de Valera was prepared to enter a conference to ascertain how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire can best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. If the answer was in the affirmative, a conference at Inverness was proposed for the 20th. On September 12, Mr. de Valera wrote accepting this invitation, but in his letter he stated, "Our nation has formally declared its independence and recognizes itself as a sovereign state. It is only as the representatives of that state and as its chosen guardians that we have any authority or powers to act on behalf of our people." On this, the Prime Minister dismissed the 2 Irish emissaries who bore the message to his retreat at Gairloch, and cancelled the arrangements for the conference. Nevertheless, there was a well-founded feeling that neither side wished to see the whole parley break down, and the letters and telegrams continued to pass backwards and forwards perseveringly. Mr. de Valera would no doubt have gone on indefinitely fighting theoretical points without the slightest regard to the resultant misery and material ruin of his countrymen. But meanwhile, behind the tightly closed doors of the Dáil, in almost continuous session at Dublin, and in the central conclaves of the Sinn Féin extremists, a definite and resolute movement of opinion grew up against him. Anarchy, stark, sheer, and progressively degenerating, might at any moment lay its talons upon Southern Ireland. The genius of the Irish race has a soberly practical side, and men with forces behind them stood forth from the confusion, men whose melancholy credentials could not be impuged, but whose aims were sane and whose word was their bond. These men were determined not to throw away what had been gained. No whisper of these divisions in Sinn Féin had yet reached the outer air. But Mr. de Valera's reply to the Prime Minister's cancellation of the conference was appreciably more conciliatory. Eventually he explained that he and his friends had no thought of committing the British government to any conditions as a prelude to a conference. They could not abandon their national position, but neither did they expect a similar surrender by the British government. A treaty, he suggested, between Great Britain and Ireland would end the dispute forever and enable the 2 nations, each pursuing its own development, to work together in free and friendly cooperation in affairs of common concern. He invited the Prime Minister to state whether the British government was demanding a surrender of the Sinn Féin position as a preliminary to conference or whether the conference could open free on both sides. The Cabinet Committee, which met at Gairloch on September 21, in these circumstances, after reiterating their fundamental position, drafted a fresh invitation, sent on the 19th, to a conference in London on October 11, where they could meet the delegates of Sinn Féin with a view to ascertain how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire might best be reconciled with Irish aspirations. This invitation, sufficiently vague in character, was accepted, and on the appointed date the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain, Lord Birkenhead, Sir Laming Worthington Evans, Sir Hammer Greenwood, and myself met the Irish representatives, Mr. Griffith, Mr. Michael Collins, Mr. Barton, Mr. Gavin Duffy, and Mr. Duggan, in the Cabinet Room at Downing Street. It was significant that Mr. de Valera remained in Ireland. It is not easy to measure the internal stresses set up in the Unionist Party by these events. Although everyone in every party had been swept from his political socket by the cataract of world events, although human fortunes still ran in rapids all over the world, and men were baffled and bewildered by all that was going on and exhausted by all that had happened, yet the giving up in these ignominious circumstances of lifelong convictions was almost intolerable. Resentment gathered all the deeper because those who felt the most keenly were among the most tenacious elements of the nation knew that they were powerless. Ulster remained deeply agitated and refused to associate with the government. The 300,000 loyalists in Southern Ireland, perfectly helpless in the fighting, raised a lamentable cry in the parley. At this stage much depended upon the action of individual ministers. It was easy for Liberals and Home Rulers to support the widest form of Irish self-government, but those whose whole political careers had been absorbed in fighting Home Rule had a disagreeable and hazardous task to accomplish. The chief responsibility fell upon the leader of the Unionist Party, Mr. Austen Chamberlain. He had acted throughout in the closest harmony with the Prime Minister, and he was a man prepared to carry his actions to their conclusion and to face any consequences personal to him. When a leader takes a course fundamentally divergent from the whole traditions and even character of his party, it is often open to some other prominent man to acquire great and possibly dominant political power. No one can impugn his motives. He is only carrying on in the old way, in a straightforward, simple, and consistent manner. Such a man will find himself sustained by great numbers of persons of the highest integrity. His actions, however favorable to his ambition, will always appear to be sanctioned by duty and conviction. The attitude of Lord Birkenhead, then Lord Chancellor, was therefore at this juncture of the utmost importance. He was prominently and peculiarly connected with the resistance to Home Rule. He had been in comradeship with Sir Edward Carson. He had used to the full those threats of civil war which had played their part in the 1914 phase of the Irish conflict. There was no man who would have gained greater personal advantage by opposing the Irish settlement, and no one who would suffer more reproach by sustaining it. He now appeared, in the teeth alike of his past and his future, as its most aggressive conservative supporter. The Irish Free Staters have always felt that they owed him their gratitude, and they are right. At this juncture, qualities of independent and fearless judgment in the leader of the Unionist Party and in his most powerful lieutenant played their part in history. Political systems can to some extent be appraised by the test of whether their leading representatives are or are not capable of taking decisions in great matters on their merits, in defiance of their own interests and often of their best friends. In due course, after many delays and much manoeuvring, the Irish delegates arrived in Downing Street, and those members of the cabinet who, from their offices or from their personalities, were deemed to be the chief actors, met across the table those whom they had so recently denounced as the murder gang. All these Irish delegates had recently been in prison or had been hunted for their lives, and some in varying degrees had been associated with violent crime. The confrontation was not without its shock, and for some weeks the strictest formalities were observed. Not only were the discussions themselves baffling through their vagueness and uncertainty, but they were cumbered with a bulky mass of intricate and highly explosive detail. The negotiations, private and public, were continued for 2 months. They were reacted upon at all stages by the internal stresses of the Conservative Party and the convulsions of the newly reassembled Irish Dáil. Disorders broke out in Belfast. The Ulster government declared that they were being betrayed and, although they refused to come to the conference, complained that they were not even consulted. The political tension was almost as acute as in the months before the war, but without the solvent of catastrophic events. Things merely lagged. The Irish could not say yes or no to anything. The condition of Ireland degenerated daily, and the Conservative Party, with 2/3 of the House of Commons in its ranks, stirred with anger and distress. Although I only played at this time a part of second rank in Irish affairs and therefore did not feel the full pressures, I had as a member of the Cabinet Committee a decided opinion. We must go through with the business and persevere until we either were dismissed from power or reached a settlement, or reopened in a new form hostilities against Southern Ireland. I urged that ministers could not escape from their miseries by resignation. The desire for release was in the early part of November so general that no one could predict the fortunes of a single day. The degree of the crisis can perhaps in after days be as well measured by the following letter, of no particular consequence as by any other test. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister, November 9, 1921. The criticism will certainly be made that the government in resigning have abdicated their responsibility. More especially will this charge be made if the reason given is, we are debarred by honor from coercing the North and by conviction from coercing the South. It will be said, here are men united in principle, knowing what they ought to do and what the interests of the country require, who are possessed of an overwhelming parliamentary majority, including a majority of their own followers, who nevertheless, without facing Parliament, throw down the Commission and declare themselves incapable of action in any direction. I greatly fear the consequences of such tactics, no matter how lofty may the motives which prompt them. Second, after this has occurred, Mr. Bonar-Law will be invited to form a government. Why should he not do so? Surely he would be bound in honor to do so, if the members of the present government have declared themselves inhibited from moving in any direction. Why should he not succeed? In the crisis under consideration, the Conservative Party will have to rally to someone. Obviously, they will rally to a Conservative leader, forming a Conservative government, which has come forward to fill the gap created by the suicide of the coalition, and which will be entitled to carry the standard forward against Labour at an imminent election, and to receive considerate treatment from ex-ministers who have just thrown up the sponge. The delusion that an alternative government cannot be formed is perennial. Mr. Chamberlain thought Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman would be hissed off the stage. Mr. Asquith was confident that you could not form an administration, but in neither case did the outgoing administration tie its hands in every direction by proclaiming itself honorably bound to do what the situation might require. On these lines a very great public disaster might easily ensue, in which a reactionary Conservative government might go forward to the polls against Labour, with the great central mass of England and Scotland remaining without leadership or decisive influence. Third, I wish to put on record that I consider that it is our duty to carry forward the policy about Ireland in which we believe, until we are defeated in the House of Commons, and thus honourably relieved from our duty to the Crown. From the outset it became of the utmost importance to convince those who were now accepted as the Irish leaders of the sincerity and goodwill of the imperial government. The issue was too grave for bargaining and haggling. We stated from the very beginning all that we were prepared to give, and that in no circumstances could we go any further. We also made it clear that if our offer were accepted, we would without hesitation carry it through without regard to any political misfortune which might in consequence fall upon the government or upon its leading members. On this basis, therefore, and in this spirit, the long and critical negotiations were conducted. We found ourselves confronted in the early days not only with the unpractical and visionary fanaticism and romanticism in the extreme Irish secret societies, but also with those tides of distrust and hatred which had flowed between the two countries for so many centuries. An essential element in dynamite and every other high explosive is some intense acid. These terrible liquids, slowly and elaborately prepared, unite with perfectly innocent carbon compounds to give that pent-up, concentrated blasting power which shatters the structures and the lives of men. Hatred plays the same part in government as acids in chemistry. And here in Ireland were hatreds which, in Mr. Kipling's phrase, would eat the live steel from the rifle butt. Hatreds such as, thank God, in Great Britain had not existed for 100 years. All this we had to overcome. Mr. Griffith was a writer who had studied deeply European history and the polity of states. He was a man of great firmness of character and of high integrity. He was that unusual figure, a silent Irishman. He hardly ever said a word, but no word that ever issued from his lips in my presence did he ever unsay. Michael Collins had not enjoyed the same advantages in education as his elder colleague, but he had elemental qualities and mother wit which were in many ways remarkable. He stood far nearer to the terrible incidents of the conflict than his leader. His prestige and influence with the extreme parties in Ireland for that reason were far higher. His difficulties in his own heart and with his associates were far greater. The other delegates were overshadowed by the two leaders. Mr. Duggan, however, was a sober-minded, resolute man. In the background Mr. Erskine Childers, though not a delegate, pressed extreme counsels. In the end, after 2 months of futilities and rigmarole, scarred by outrages in Ireland in breach of the truce, unutterably wearied ministers faced the Irish delegates, themselves in actual desperation and knowing well that death stood at their elbows. When we met on the afternoon of December 5, the Prime Minister stated bluntly that we could concede no more and debate no further. They must settle now. They must sign the agreement for a treaty in the form to which after all these weeks it had attained, or else quit, and further that both sides would be free to resume whatever warfare they could wage against each other. This was an ultimatum delivered, not through diplomatic channels, but face to face, and all present knew and understood that nothing else was possible. Stiff as our personal relations had been, there was by now a mutual respect between the principals and a very deep comprehension of each other's difficulties. The Irishman gulped down the ultimatum phlegmatically. Mr. Griffith said, speaking in his soft voice and with his modest manner, "I will give the answer of the Irish delegates at 9 tonight. But, Mr. Prime Minister, I personally will sign this agreement and will recommend it to my countrymen." "Do I understand, Mr. Griffith," said Mr. Lloyd George, "that though everyone else refuses, you will nevertheless agree to sign?" "Yes, that is so, Mr. Prime Minister," replied this quiet little man of great heart and of great purpose. Michael Collins rose looking as if he was going to shoot someone, preferably himself. "In all my life I have never seen so much passion and suffering in restraint." We then went off and drummed our heels and had some food and smoked, and discussed plans of campaign. No one expected that anyone but Mr. Griffith would agree, and what validity would his solitary signature possess? As for ourselves, we had already ruptured the loyalties of our friends and supporters. The British representatives were in their places at 9, but it was not until long after midnight that the Irish delegation appeared. As before, they were superficially calm and very quiet. There was a long pause, or there seemed to be. Then Mr. Griffith said, "Mr. Prime Minister, the delegation is willing to sign the agreement, but there are a few points of drafting which perhaps it would be convenient if I mentioned at once." Thus, by the easiest of gestures, he carried the whole matter into the region of minor detail, and everyone concentrated upon these points with overstrained interest, so as to drive the main issue into the background forever. Soon we were talking busily about technicalities and verbal corrections, and holding firmly to all these lest worse should befall. But underneath this protective chatter a profound change had taken place in the spirit and atmosphere. We had become allies and associates in a common cause, the cause of the Irish Treaty and of peace between two races and two islands. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning before we separated, but the agreement was signed by all. As the Irishmen rose to leave, the British ministers, upon a strong impulse, walked round and for the first time shook hands. We shall see in later chapters how many toils and vexations lay in the path of the Irish settlement, and how many disappointments and anxieties were in store for both sides. But this was the moment, not soon to be forgotten, when the waters were parted and the streams of destiny began to flow down new valleys towards new seas. The event was fatal to the Prime Minister. Within a year he had been driven from power. Many other causes, some at least of which could have been avoided, contributed to his fall. But the Irish Treaty and its circumstances were unforgivable by the most tenacious elements in the Conservative Party. Even among those who steadfastly supported it, there were many who said, "It must needs be that offences come, but woe to that man by whom the offence cometh." Yet, in so far as Mr. Lloyd George can link his political misfortunes with this Irish story, he may be content. In falling through Irish difficulties, he may fall with Essex and with Strafford, with Pitt and with Gladstone, and with a line of sovereigns and statesmen, great or small, spread across the English history books of 700 years. But Lloyd George falls with this weighty difference, that whereas all these others, however great their efforts and sacrifices, left behind them only a problem, he has achieved, must we not hope it, a solution.